A black woman, sharp and confident, boarded her flight after a long week of work, ready to settle into her first-class seat. But just moments after she placed her bag in the overhead bin, a flight attendant's eyes narrowed. The woman was polite, but the attendant's tone was anything but. Every word, every gesture, seemed designed to cut her down, small remarks disguised as protocol, subtle enough that most passengers barely noticed. But 3 minutes later, something shifted. The flight attendant's smirk faded, and within moments, she was scrambling to apologize in front of the entire cabin. What happened next left everyone speechless and made one thing crystal clear. Stay with me, this is a story you'll want to hear to the very end. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you find stories like this important, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The airport was alive with the dull roar of travelers, rolling suitcases, and hurried announcements that blurred into the background like faint echoes of another world. Lisa Monroe stepped inside, the blast of air conditioning brushing her skin, a small relief from the heat outside. She wasn't late, but time felt tight in her chest. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she maneuvered through the crowd, clutching her carry-on bag close to her side. She had barely slept the night before, too much riding on this business trip. Too many loose ends she hadn't yet tied up. But this wasn't the first time she had pushed through exhaustion. Lisa's phone buzzed in her palm. An email from her boss. Big meeting tomorrow. All eyes on you. Her stomach tightened. The weight of expectation was familiar. Like an old companion she hadn't quite shaken off. But it sat heavy all the same. Her mind wandered briefly to her daughter, Jasmine, back home with her mother. Dinner plans had been promised and postponed, the kind of small disappointments Lisa carried quietly, knowing there wasn't much space for guilt in the life she had chosen. As she reached the gate, the scene felt almost routine. People stood in loose clusters, caught in their own little bubbles, couples whispering, business travelers glued to their laptops, families juggling children and too many bags. Lisa stepped forward, ticket in hand, and for the first time, her gaze caught the sharp features of the flight attendant at the entrance to the jet bridge. The name tag read, Emily. Emily's smile was polite, professional, but something about it didn't reach her eyes. Her posture was stiff, almost rehearsed, the kind of stiffness that didn't come from standing too long but from something else. Something harder to name. Lisa didn't overthink it. She offered a brief nod, her voice light. Good evening. Emily's eyes flicked over the ticket in Lisa's hand, scanning it with the detached efficiency of someone uninterested in small talk. First class, seat 3B. Emily said, returning the ticket without a smile. Her tone was flat, almost dismissive. Lisa paused for half a second, not enough to let it settle, but enough for the moment to linger. She was used to the brusqueness of flight attendants, they had long days too. Still, there was something about Emily's tone that sat awkwardly in the back of her mind. Like the faint hum of static you can't quite tune out. On board, Lisa made her way to her seat near the front, adjusting her bag carefully as she placed it in the overhead compartment. The first-class cabin was half full, quiet, spacious, the kind of luxury she hadn't often experienced. It was a hard-earned seat, not a gift. She had fought for promotions, stayed late, swallowed frustrations when colleagues talked over her in meetings, and she had arrived here on her own merit. As she settled into seat 3B, the edges of pride brushed against the weariness she carried. She had made it this far. That's when it happened. Her elbow grazed the edge of the drink cart. It wasn't forceful, just a light tap, but Emily was there in an instant. Careful, ma'am, Emily snapped, her voice slicing through the soft murmur of the cabin. Her eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of irritation flashing across her face. Let's try not to make a mess. Lisa froze. She glanced down at the cart, which hadn't moved more than an inch. The overreaction hit her like cold water. I'm sorry, Lisa said quickly, her voice soft, as if apologizing too loudly might cause more trouble. But Emily didn't respond. She gave Lisa a lingering look, a glance that didn't feel accidental, before she continued down the aisle. Lisa sat still, her body rigid against the seat. The plane hadn't even left the ground, and already the mood had shifted. It wasn't the words, it was the way they were said, the unspoken something beneath them. A tone she had encountered before in stores, in meetings, in passing interactions that cut just deep enough to sting. The worst part was the way the other passengers around her pretended not to notice. Lisa felt their eyes flicker toward her and then quickly away, as if drawn by instinct and a shared understanding that no one wanted to acknowledge. She took a breath and told herself to let it go. But the feeling lingered, stubborn and heavy. The plane continued to fill, the gentle buzz of conversation growing as families filed in and businessmen shuffled past. Settling into their seats, Emily passed by again, this time with a tray of pre-flight drinks. Lisa watched as Emily's smile softened when she handed a glass of champagne to the man across the aisle, a tall, middle-aged white man in a tailored suit. When Emily turned back to Lisa, the warmth evaporated. "Would you like something to drink, ma'am?" "No, thank you." Lisa met her eyes directly. But Emily's gaze drifted past her, as if she hadn't really asked the question in the first place. Lisa's hands curled in her lap. She told herself she was imagining it. Maybe she was tired, reading too much into simple exchanges. But the discomfort didn't loosen its grip. The thing about moments like this, the subtle ones, the ones that don't leave bruises or visible scars, is that they don't need to be loud. They live in the small cracks of everyday life. In the quiet way space shifts around you. In the knowledge that some people move through the world without having to prove they belong. Lisa thought about her daughter. About how many times Jasmine might feel this same weight when she grew older. By the time the plane began its taxi down the runway, Lisa had braced herself for a long flight. The air between her and Emily wasn't just cold. It was thick with something unspoken. And Lisa knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end of it. The hum of the engine settled into a steady vibration, filling the cabin with a false sense of calm. Lisa rested her head against the seat, eyes closed but not quite asleep. The plane had barely reached cruising altitude, but already she could feel the edges of the flight pressing in on her, not the physical space, but the weight of something else. Emily hadn't returned to Lisa's row since that brief exchange about the drink cart. But Lisa could still feel her presence, moving in and out of the aisles like an echo you couldn't shake. She told herself not to make more of it. Don't feed it, don't give it life. But racism, Lisa had long ago learned, didn't need to be loud to thrive. It grew in silence, in the polite nods and measured smiles, in the small hesitations that told you exactly how someone saw you, not as you were, but as who they imagined you to be. She shifted in her seat, forcing herself to focus on the meeting ahead. Tomorrow was important, more than important, critical. Lisa had worked her way into this role with deliberate precision. Every presentation, every late night spent at her desk, every time she held her tongue when a colleague claimed credit for her ideas, it had all led here. To a seat in first class. To a meeting that could determine the next 5 years of her career. That seat wasn't free. The thought was still circling her mind when she felt Emily's presence again. This time, Emily wasn't alone. A second flight attendant trailed behind her, a younger woman with soft features and dark hair pulled into a neat bun. Lisa hadn't caught her name, but something about her felt different, less guarded. Emily stopped at Lisa's row. Her eyes flicked downward. "Ma'am, I'll need to check your seatbelt." Lisa opened her eyes fully, glancing down at the buckle that was already secured across her lap. "It's fastened," Lisa said, her voice measured. Emily didn't move. "Could you lift your arm? I need to check." Lisa hesitated, just for a second, not because she doubted her own eyes, but because she recognized the moment for what it was. A small test, a quiet assertion of control. There were at least 10 other passengers within arm's reach. Not one of them had been asked to demonstrate their seatbelt. Lisa slowly lifted her arm. Emily leaned in, the buckle clicking under her fingers as she gave it a firm tug. It didn't budge. "All set," Emily said, straightening with a tight smile that didn't quite touch her lips. Lisa didn't smile back. Instead, she looked past Emily, catching the younger flight attendant's eye for the briefest moment. There was something there, something unspoken. A flicker of embarrassment, perhaps, or sympathy. But the moment passed. Emily turned and disappeared down the aisle, her polished heels tapping out a rhythm that Lisa couldn't ignore. She exhaled slowly, releasing the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Let it go. But letting it go was never as simple as it sounded. Lisa had learned, over time, that the world was rarely kind to black women who spoke up too quickly. You wait, you watch, you choose your moment. Because there were rules, invisible ones, unwritten but always understood. If she had challenged Emily then and there, it wouldn't have been Emily who bore the weight of the moment. It would have been Lisa. The angry black woman. The one making trouble on a flight. The one who didn't know how to relax. Lisa leaned back in her seat, watching as the clouds stretched out beyond the window. The tension didn't fade. A few rows ahead, Emily laughed lightly as she poured a glass of wine for an older man in a crisp navy suit. Her posture had shifted, easier, friendlier. The small stiffness in her shoulders had melted away, like ice under warm water. Lisa watched her from the corner of her eye, wondering if the man had noticed the difference. She doubted he had, because that was the thing. Men like him rarely had to notice. Lisa's mind wandered as she stared out the window. She thought of her daughter. Of how, one day, Jasmine might find herself in moments like this. Moments that seemed small but felt so much larger than they appeared. She would have to explain it to her. How do you teach a child to recognize the subtlety of prejudice? How do you explain that it isn't always in the form of harsh words or open insults? Sometimes it lives in the polite spaces, where no one raises their voice but the message is clear. Lisa didn't know. The hum of the engine seemed louder now, pressing against her ears as if to fill the space left by her thoughts. She picked up the in-flight magazine from the seat pocket and flipped through the pages, hoping to distract herself, but the words blurred, and her mind drifted back to Emily, to the way she had leaned just a little closer than necessary, to the way her smile softened when speaking to others but sharpened like glass in Lisa's direction. The thing about moments like this, Lisa realized, was that they stuck. They lingered in the body like old injuries, surfacing when you least expected them. She closed the magazine and set it aside. For now, she would wait, but something told her this wasn't over. The plane had been in the air for nearly an hour, long enough for the cabin to settle into the quiet rhythm of flight pages turning, soft conversations drifting like smoke, and the occasional clinking of glasses as drinks were poured and sipped. Lisa kept her eyes on the clouds, the soft expanse of white stretching endlessly beyond the window. It was peaceful up here, detached from the weight of the world below. And yet, the tension in her chest refused to dissipate. She wasn't imagining it. She could feel Emily's eyes on her. It wasn't constant, but it was there. The occasional glance as she moved down the aisle. The slight hesitation whenever their eyes met, quick, fleeting, but unmistakable. Lisa had felt it before. In meetings where her ideas were praised but never attributed to her. In stores where clerks watched her a little too closely. In interviews where she was perfectly qualified but somehow wasn't quite the right fit. The thing about racism, Lisa knew, was that it rarely announced itself with grand gestures. More often, it was a whisper, a glance, a pause, and sometimes, it was nothing at all but you felt it all the same. Emily wasn't doing much, not enough for anyone else to notice. But Lisa noticed. She noticed in the way that people who have spent their lives being measured and judged notice. The soft brush of Emily's disapproval was like a pebble in Lisa's shoe. Small, but relentless. Lisa shifted in her seat and glanced around the cabin. The man across the aisle, silver hair, leather briefcase at his feet, was engrossed in his tablet. A few rows ahead, a woman with a toddler bounced him gently on her knee, whispering a lullaby too soft for Lisa to make out. No one else seemed to notice the slow unraveling that was happening just beneath the surface. Lisa exhaled and told herself to let it go. But letting it go was easier said than done. She remembered something her grandmother used to say. You can swallow the bitterness, but it doesn't mean it'll disappear. Lisa didn't realize how tightly she was gripping the armrest until Emily reappeared at her row, standing just close enough to block her view of the aisle. Ma'am, Emily's voice was sweet. Almost too sweet. Are you sure you don't want something to drink? I'd hate for you to sit here the entire flight with nothing. Lisa's eyes narrowed slightly. No, thank you. I'm fine. Emily lingered, as if waiting for Lisa to change her mind. When she didn't, Emily's gaze flicked down toward Lisa's purse resting on the seat beside her. You know, Emily said, lowering her voice just a fraction. If your bag's not properly stored, it could be a safety hazard. Lisa stared at her. It's under the seat. I checked. Emily didn't blink. I'll double-check that for you. Before Lisa could protest, Emily leaned down, brushing too close to Lisa's legs as she reached for the purse. She nudged it unnecessarily, adjusting it by no more than an inch. "There," Emily said, standing straight again. "We can't be too careful." Lisa didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Because this wasn't about the purse. It never was. Emily smiled tight, rehearsed and moved on to the next row, her shoes clicking against the floor as if nothing had happened. But something had. Lisa could feel it in the way the air shifted around her. The woman seated behind her leaned forward slightly, as if to say something, but then hesitated and settled back into her seat. Lisa let her eyes drift back to the window. But the clouds didn't look as peaceful now. Her grandmother's voice echoed again in her mind. "Don't let them make you small." Lisa unclenched her hands and rested them in her lap, forcing herself to breathe. The game Emily was playing wasn't new. Lisa had encountered it before. But it was exhausting in a way that words couldn't quite capture. Because no matter how far Lisa had climbed, no matter how many promotions, awards, or accolades she collected, there was always someone ready to remind her that she didn't really belong. That first-class seat? It might as well have come with an invisible asterisk. Lisa swallowed the knot rising in her throat and reached for her phone. Her finger hovered over Jasmine's name in her contact list. She considered sending a quick message, something light, something ordinary, but she stopped herself. This wasn't a story she wanted to tell her daughter. Not yet. Jasmine was still young. There would be time enough for lessons like this. But Lisa wanted to delay it for as long as she could. She glanced back toward the front of the plane. Emily stood near the galley, laughing softly at something another passenger said. The laugh came easy, as if the moment with Lisa had never happened. And maybe for Emily, it hadn't. Lisa knew better. The hum of the engines pressed against her ears, filling the silence that stretched between them. The tension wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane cruised through the thin air, casting soft shadows across the faces of passengers who had begun to drift into the strange half-sleep of long flights. Lisa wasn't among them. She sat upright, eyes fixed on the small screen embedded in the seat ahead, though she hadn't pressed play on any of the films flashing across the menu. Her mind was elsewhere, tangled in the events of the past hour, Emily's quiet intrusions, the unspoken weight behind each interaction. Lisa had faced moments like these before. That was the thing, this wasn't new. It was ancient, familiar, stitched into the very fabric of the world she lived in. A quiet war fought on invisible fronts. But it wasn't the confrontation itself that wore her down. It was the waiting. Waiting for the next glance. The next word said just loud enough to cut, but not so sharp that it bled in a way others could see. Emily hadn't come by again since she adjusted the purse. But Lisa could feel it, the lingering presence of someone who still believed she had the upper hand. A petty woman with too much time and too little power. Lisa's grandmother had warned her about them. She remembered the stories, told in hushed tones over the kitchen table. "Baby," her grandmother had said once, "there are two kinds of people you'll meet out there. The ones who'll look right through you and the ones who'll make sure you know they see you but not the way you want to be seen." Lisa didn't know which one was worse. Across the aisle, the older man with the tablet shifted in his seat, shooting Lisa a quick, polite smile. She returned it faintly, but her focus never left the narrow galley at the front of the plane. Emily was standing there, speaking quietly with another flight attendant. Lisa watched as Emily gestured lightly in her direction, just a flick of the eyes and a barely there tilt of the head. Whatever she said, the other attendant didn't laugh. She didn't even respond. She simply nodded and walked away, leaving Emily alone with whatever satisfaction she thought she'd earned. Lisa clenched her jaw. It was moments like this that crept under your skin. Not the grand humiliations, but the small, cutting ones. The kind that left you wondering if maybe, just maybe, you were imagining it. But Lisa knew better than to doubt herself. The other passengers may not have noticed, but they didn't have to. Racism didn't need to be witnessed by the crowd to feel real. She could feel it right now. Lisa took a slow breath, pressing her shoulders against the seat. She wouldn't let this ruin her trip. There was too much riding on tomorrow. But the truth pressed down like a weight she couldn't shrug off. No matter how far she had come, no matter how many times she had proved herself, there was always someone like Emily standing in the doorway, blocking the path just enough to remind her she still had to ask permission. Lisa tapped her fingers lightly against her knee. Restless, she considered calling for one of the attendants, not Emily, but the younger one with the soft eyes. Perhaps she could ask for a cup of tea or water. Something to reset the rhythm of the flight. But even as the thought crossed her mind, Lisa hesitated. She didn't want Emily anywhere near her row, and asking for service felt like inviting more than she was prepared to handle. "You're overthinking it," she told herself. But that was the point. When you're Black in America, the overthinking isn't paranoia, it's preparation. Lisa sighed and reached for her phone, scrolling aimlessly through emails she had already read twice. She was halfway through rereading an old message from her daughter's teacher when she felt the soft pull of the curtain separating first class from coach. Emily stepped through, her face neutral but her eyes flicking, scanning the cabin like she was looking for something out of place. Her gaze found Lisa almost instantly. There it was, that lingering pause. Emily didn't speak, but the look carried weight. It said, "I see you. I haven't forgotten." Lisa lifted her chin slightly, holding the stare just long enough to make it clear she wasn't intimidated. Emily lingered a moment longer, then turned and disappeared back into the galley. Lisa exhaled slowly, but the weight in the room hadn't lifted. A few minutes passed, and then quietly one of the other attendants approached. The younger one. She bent slightly at Lisa's side, lowering her voice so only Lisa could hear. "Ma'am, I just wanted to check in. Is everything all right?" Lisa's eyes flicked up, meeting the woman's gaze. There was something there, recognition, an acknowledgement that didn't need to be spoken aloud. "I'm fine," Lisa said softly. The attendant nodded, but she didn't move right away. "I saw what happened earlier," the woman added after a pause. "If you need anything, let me know." Lisa felt something shift. Not the weight entirely, but a small crack in it, enough to let a little air in. "Thank you," Lisa said quietly. The woman smiled faintly and walked away, but the moment lingered between them. Lisa glanced back toward the galley, but Emily wasn't there. For the first time since the flight began, Lisa allowed herself to relax, even if just by a degree. Because sometimes, that's all it took. A quiet acknowledgement, a reminder that even in the smallest of battles, you weren't always alone. The cabin had fallen into a hush. The kind of quiet that settles over long flights when the excitement of takeoff fades and the hours ahead stretch out like a road vanishing into fog. Lisa sat still, her gaze tracing the contours of the empty glass on her tray table. She wasn't thirsty, but there was something about the glass, the way it caught the low light. How it stood as the only thing between her and the widening gulf of unspoken tension that anchored her. Emily hadn't passed by in a while, but Lisa could feel her absence like a stone pressing against her ribs. That was the thing about racism. It didn't always announce itself with raised voices or slurs that pierced the air. Sometimes, it was quiet, a withdrawal, a deliberate pulling away meant to make you feel smaller without ever having to say a word. And in the space left behind, the silence swelled. Lisa shifted in her seat, glancing around the cabin. The man across the aisle was asleep now, chin tucked into his chest, the tablet slipping from his lap. The mother with the toddler had finally coaxed the child to sleep, his small head resting against her shoulder. The world around her felt calm, but Lisa's world felt anything but. Her body knew before her mind fully registered it. Emily was near again. Lisa could see her reflection faintly in the window. Emily stood just a few rows back, speaking softly to another passenger. Lisa didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The air between them thickened like storm clouds gathering, the kind of tension that carried no shape but took up space all the same. Lisa had spent years learning how to sit with this feeling, how to wear patience like armor and swallow her frustrations until they settled at the bottom of her stomach. Hard as stone. But something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the long hours she had poured into preparing for the meeting. Maybe it was the weight of all the other moments she had let slide. The quiet humiliations she had convinced herself weren't worth the fight. Or maybe it was just exhaustion, the kind that runs deeper than lack of sleep. Lisa watched as Emily drifted closer, lingering in the row behind hers. Her voice soft but audible enough to carry. "Ma'am, if you'd like, I can help you with that overhead compartment." Lisa's stomach tightened. She recognized the voice. It wasn't Emily's. It belonged to the other flight attendant, the younger one who had stopped by earlier. But she wasn't speaking to Lisa. The woman in the row behind Lisa murmured something in response. Her voice polite, appreciative, a soft exchange. No friction, no hesitation. Lisa exhaled, feeling the tension in her shoulders unwind just slightly. But as Emily stepped into view again, standing at the edge of Lisa's row, Lisa knew it was temporary. Emily's eyes flicked to Lisa's tray table. The glass. You haven't had much to drink, have you? Lisa met her gaze. I wasn't thirsty. Emily didn't blink. Well, if you need anything else. She let the sentence hang there, unfinished, like a hook without bait. Lisa smiled, faintly polite but firm. I'll be sure to let you know. Emily held her gaze a second too long, as if weighing the response, searching for something unsaid, and then, with a small nod, she slipped away. Lisa let out a slow breath, the glass catching the soft reflection of her faint smile. She wasn't imagining it. Emily's every word, every glance, was carefully chosen, a performance of politeness stretched just thin enough to reveal the shape of something far less kind underneath. Lisa wasn't sure if Emily expected her to snap, to raise her voice, to call her out in front of the passengers. But Lisa knew the rules of this game. If she spoke too loudly, she would be the one who made others uncomfortable. She would be the one who disrupted the peace of the cabin. And wasn't that how it always went? She thought of the stories her mother used to tell. Stories about buses and counter stools. About the right to sit in a seat and be left alone. Lisa remembered sitting at her mother's feet, wide-eyed, asking the same question over and over. But why didn't they just walk away? Her mother's voice had been quiet but steady. Baby, sometimes you have to stay seated so the world knows you belong there. Lisa glanced out the window again, the sky stretching endlessly beyond the glass. She wasn't going anywhere, but neither was Emily. The weight of the night pressed on Lisa's chest, but it wasn't heavy enough to break her. She had carried this before. She would carry it again. Because in this world, one that too often demanded she shrink herself to fit, it was the refusal to disappear that became the quietest, most powerful act of resistance. The hum of the engines was steady, but Lisa could feel the plane tilting, ever so slightly, as if the air itself carried a weight too heavy to hold. She hadn't touched the glass on her tray. It sat there like a witness, reflecting the quiet war she was waging in silence. The first-class cabin felt smaller now, tighter. The rows of plush seats and soft lighting didn't ease the pressure gathering beneath Lisa's ribs. Emily had made herself scarce. But even in absence, she lingered. That's how these things worked. The people who wielded power in subtle ways never needed to stay in the room to leave their mark. Lisa knew this dance well, the slow, grinding ritual of people testing the limits of how far they could push you before you pushed back. And more often than not, they weren't even aware they were doing it. Emily probably thought she was clever, that none of it mattered, that by the time the wheels touched the runway, Lisa would walk off the plane with no proof of what had transpired. No proof, but plenty of memory. Lisa shifted her gaze, scanning the cabin. Most of the passengers were asleep now, heads tilted awkwardly against pillows. The older man across the aisle was snoring lightly, his tablet abandoned, screen black. She envied their ease, the ease of moving through the world without having to measure every glance, every word, every flicker of tension that crossed someone's face. Lisa was still awake, not because she couldn't sleep but because she didn't dare let her guard down. It was exhausting. And yet, what choice did she have? Lisa's thoughts wandered back to her daughter. Jasmine was only 9, but she had already started to notice the differences. Why do the other girls always touch my hair without asking? Jasmine had asked one evening at dinner. Lisa had smiled, brushing her daughter's curls back from her forehead, though the question lingered longer than it should have. She didn't know how to explain to Jasmine that there would be a lifetime of small invasions ahead. A lifetime of people assuming that parts of her belonged to them to touch, to question, to judge. How do you explain that? Lisa leaned back in her seat, staring at the ceiling. Maybe you don't. Maybe you just hold on to those stories until she's ready to carry them. As she closed her eyes, trying to shut out the weight pressing against her, she felt it again, that presence. Emily. Lisa didn't open her eyes, but she knew. The soft shuffle of footsteps near her row, the brief hesitation. Emily lingered, as if daring Lisa to acknowledge her. Lisa stayed still, refusing to give her the satisfaction. But Emily spoke anyway. Ma'am, she said softly, almost apologetic. I noticed your seatbelt wasn't fully secured earlier. I just wanted to make sure everything was in order. Lisa opened her eyes slowly, tilting her head just enough to meet Emily's gaze. It's secured. There was no sharpness in her tone, just the weight of exhaustion barely held at bay. Emily hesitated. Lisa could see it, the flicker of something behind her eyes. Discomfort. Lisa recognized that too. People like Emily didn't expect resistance. Not in this quiet form. They expected either silence or fury, two sides of the same coin. But what they feared most was the kind of stillness Lisa held now. Emily straightened, nodding stiffly, and moved on without another word. Lisa let out a slow breath, her grip on the armrest loosening. But just as she began to relax, a voice startled her. "You handled that well." Lisa turned her head. The man across the aisle had woken, watching the exchange from beneath half-lidded eyes. He looked older up close, the creases in his face deep, like rivers carved over time. Lisa gave a faint smile. "I suppose it's not the first time." He chuckled softly, adjusting the blanket on his lap. "No, I imagine it's not." For a moment, they sat in silence, the space between them feeling less like a barrier and more like an acknowledgement. "I used to see it all the time," the man said after a pause. "Back when I was working. They don't say much, but you can feel it. Can't you?" Lisa nodded. "You can always feel it." The man shifted, offering his hand across the aisle. "Raymond," he said, "retired teacher." Lisa shook his hand. "Lisa, consultant." Raymond nodded, as if the title told him more than Lisa realized. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. "You remind me of one of my students," Raymond said, settling back into his seat. "Bright kid, black, like you. Had that same look in his eye when someone tried to put him in his place. He never let it slide either." Lisa smiled faintly. "What happened to him?" Raymond sighed, his eyes drifting toward the dark window. "He became a lawyer. Made sure the next time someone tried to keep him quiet, he had the law on his side." Lisa chuckled. "That's a good ending." Raymond grinned. "It is, but it didn't come easy. Nothing ever does, does it?" Lisa shook her head, glancing down at the empty glass on her tray. "No, it doesn't." The weight pressing down on Lisa's chest hadn't lifted entirely. But for the first time since the plane took off, she felt something shift, a reminder that she wasn't alone. The quiet war waged on. But Lisa wasn't the only one fighting it. The plane cruised steadily through the night sky. But inside the cabin, the air felt heavier than it should have. Lisa sat still, aware of every breath, every shift in her seat. Raymond, across the aisle, had fallen asleep again, his chin dipping forward. The faint murmur of the other passengers had faded into the low hum of the engines. It was quiet, too quiet. Lisa had always believed that silence had a shape. In some places, it curved gently, like the edge of a smooth stone. In others, it pressed down hard, like the weight of an old grudge. Tonight, it felt like the latter. She could feel Emily watching her again. The flight attendant's presence was no longer subtle. It moved in the gaps between moments when Lisa turned her head, when she reached for her phone, when her eyes lingered on the clouds outside the window. Emily's gaze was never direct, but it was constant, hovering like an unanswered question. Lisa didn't have to guess what Emily was thinking. She had seen it before, felt it in boardrooms, in elevators, in restaurants where she sat just a little too long without being served. Emily was waiting for Lisa to react. "She wants me to break the rules." The thought settled heavily in Lisa's chest. She had seen it happen to others. The slow unraveling, the shift from subtle hostility to outright confrontation. It was the oldest trick in the book, provoke just enough to get a rise, and then let the blame fall where it was expected to land. Lisa wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. But that didn't mean she would stay quiet. Emily passed by again, her polished shoes clicking softly against the floor. Lisa lifted her head, catching Emily's eye just as she moved past her row. "Excuse me," Lisa said, her voice calm but deliberate. Emily stopped, turning back slowly. "Yes?" Lisa's gaze was steady. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" Emily's eyes flickered just for a second, but it was there, a flash of hesitation. "Of course," Emily replied, her tone smooth, but Lisa could hear the thin thread of defensiveness behind it. Lisa gestured toward the narrow space near the galley, away from the other passengers. Emily hesitated again but followed. When they reached the corner, Lisa leaned against the wall, folding her arms loosely across her chest. "I've noticed you've been paying quite a bit of attention to me tonight." Lisa began softly. Emily's face remained neutral. But Lisa could see the faint tension along her jaw. "I'm sorry if I've made you uncomfortable," Emily said, her words measured carefully. "I'm just doing my job." Lisa nodded slowly, letting the words hang between them. "I see," Lisa said. "And part of your job is adjusting someone's purse without asking? Or checking my seatbelt twice when I've already confirmed it's secure?" Emily's smile thinned. "I assure you, it wasn't personal." Lisa leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "That's the thing. It is personal, even if you don't say it out loud." Emily blinked, her posture stiffening. She opened her mouth to respond, but Lisa raised a hand gently, cutting her off before the words could form. "I don't need an apology," Lisa said, her voice quiet but firm. "I've been here before. I know how this goes. You think I'm reading too much into it. That maybe I'm imagining things. But I promise you I'm not." For the first time, Emily looked away. Lisa softened her tone, but not her stance. "I'm not angry, Emily. I'm tired. Tired of having to prove I belong somewhere I've already earned a seat." Emily's lips parted, but no words came out. Lisa exhaled slowly, watching the flicker of something regret, perhaps, or just discomfort settle over Emily's features. "This isn't just about tonight," Lisa added after a moment. "It's about what tonight represents. And whether you realize it or not, you're part of something bigger." Emily's eyes flicked toward the cabin, where the other passengers sat unaware of the quiet storm unfolding at the front of the plane. Lisa followed her gaze. "I don't expect you to fix it," Lisa said softly, "but I do expect you to think about it the next time someone like me sits in this seat." Emily nodded, a subtle, almost imperceptible motion. "I understand," she murmured. Lisa wasn't sure if she did. Not fully, not yet, but maybe that was enough for tonight. Without another word, Lisa stepped away, leaving Emily standing in the small, dimly lit space near the galley. As Lisa returned to her seat, the weight in her chest felt a little lighter. Not because the problem was solved, but because she had refused to carry it alone. The plane began its slow descent, the gentle tilt tugging Lisa forward in her seat. The announcement overhead the one passengers had heard 100 times before barely registered. "Seat backs upright. Tray tables locked. Fasten your seatbelts." Lisa didn't need to hear it. Her seatbelt had been fastened the whole flight. Outside the window, the city lights stretched out beneath the clouds, flickering like 1,000 tiny promises some kept, others broken long before they ever had the chance. Lisa rested her hands on her lap, her fingers grazing the smooth fabric of her trousers. Across the aisle, Raymond stirred from his sleep, rubbing his eyes with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who had no reason to rush. "Almost there," he muttered, half to himself. Lisa offered a faint smile. It had been a long flight. Longer than it should have been. Not in hours, but in weight. Emily hadn't returned to her row. Not after their conversation by the galley. Not even to collect the empty glass still perched quietly on Lisa's tray. Lisa wasn't surprised. She understood, in the way black people often do. That discomfort breeds distance. That once the mirror is held up, once you force someone to see the reflection they've been avoiding, they will look anywhere but in your direction. The plane jolted slightly as it descended through a patch of turbulence. Lisa braced herself, steadying her breath. There was a rhythm to these moments, the way the body tenses without thinking. Waiting for the bump to pass. For the balance to return. Maybe that's what it was like, she thought. This constant navigation through a world that wasn't built to hold you comfortably. You brace. You wait. You learn to carry the turbulence with you. Lisa's gaze drifted toward the front of the cabin. Emily was there, standing near the exit, her posture rigid, the stiffness in her shoulders betraying the polished smile she now wore. A mask, fragile and thin. Lisa could tell Emily was aware of her watching. It wasn't anger that Lisa felt. Not anymore. It was something quieter, something softer, perhaps even pity. Because the truth was this. Emily's discomfort would stay with her long after Lisa stepped off the plane. That's the thing about prejudice, it doesn't just bind the person it targets. It binds the one holding onto it, too. Lisa had carried that knowledge for years. And it was no longer heavy in her hands. The wheels met the runway with a soft, rolling thud, the plane gliding across the tarmac, pulling closer to the gate. The hum of conversation picked up around the cabin. Passengers stretching and gathering their belongings, ready to return to whatever lives waited for them beyond the terminal. Raymond yawned, tucking his tablet back into his briefcase. "Safe landing," he said, smiling at Lisa. "Safe landing," she echoed. The seatbelt sign blinked off. As Lisa stood, reaching for her bag in the overhead compartment, she felt the soft gaze of the younger flight attendant, the one who had stopped by earlier, watching her from the galley. Their eyes met briefly, and the woman gave a small nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Lisa returned the gesture, letting the unspoken acknowledgement pass between them like a shared language. The line to exit the plane moved slowly. Raymond stepped ahead, offering a polite nod to Emily as he passed by. When Lisa reached the front, Emily's eyes flicked toward her just for a second. Lisa paused, the space between them narrowing. "Have a good evening, ma'am," Emily said, her voice carefully measured, betraying nothing. Lisa held her gaze. "I intend to," she replied, not unkindly. And with that, she stepped onto the jet bridge, the cool air rushing to meet her. The airport terminal bustled with movement, but Lisa moved through it calmly, her pace unhurried. She could still feel the faint tension from the flight trailing behind her like a shadow. But it wasn't hers to carry anymore. As she walked toward baggage claim, Lisa's phone buzzed softly in her pocket. A message from her daughter. "Mom, are you home yet?" Lisa smiled as she typed back a quick reply. "Almost. I'll see you soon." She knew there would be more flights like this. More moments. More Emilys. But for now, the only thing that mattered was the road ahead, the one leading home. The airport was alive with the usual current of movement, families reuniting, travelers dragging suitcases behind them, the mechanical voices of arrival announcements cascading over the crowd. Lisa Monroe moved through it quietly, weaving between strangers, her carry-on rolling at her side. The cool hum of the jet bridge was behind her now, but the weight of the flight hadn't quite left her shoulders. She could still feel Emily's eyes, even in absence. It was remarkable, in a way, how certain moments refused to leave you, how they sank into the folds of memory like ink on paper. No matter how much distance you put between yourself and the source, it stayed, clinging stubbornly beneath the surface. Lisa adjusted the strap of her bag, exhaling softly. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. She had long ago accepted that much. But acceptance didn't mean surrender. Near the baggage carousel, clusters of people stood in half circles, eyes fixed on the conveyor belt that had not yet begun to move. Lisa found a spot near the edge, placing enough space between herself and the nearest passenger to avoid small talk. She wasn't in the mood for it. Her phone buzzed in her pocket again. Another message from Jasmine. "Mom, can we have pancakes for dinner?" Lisa smiled faintly, her fingers typing out a quick reply. "Sure, I'll be home soon." She tucked the phone away, watching as the belt creaked to life with a mechanical groan. One by one, bags emerged from behind the rubber curtain, sliding onto the carousel like pieces of someone else's life. Lisa watched as each suitcase passed, waiting for hers to appear. The terminal lights were too bright, casting long shadows beneath her feet. Raymond's voice startled her. "I always forget how long this part takes." Lisa turned, finding him just a few feet away, his leather briefcase now tucked beneath his arm. His coat was unbuttoned, and he looked more relaxed than he had during the flight. "Feels longer at night," Lisa replied. Raymond nodded, stepping closer, his gaze fixed on the slow-moving carousel. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said quietly. Lisa glanced at him. "What part?" Raymond's eyes softened. "The part about belonging. About being tired of proving you've earned a place you shouldn't have to justify." Lisa shifted, letting the words settle. "It's not just me," she said after a pause. "It's all of us, in one way or another. You spend your life fighting for a seat. And once you get there, someone still wants to check your ticket." Raymond chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. "True," he said. "I used to think it would get easier with age. That after a while, people would stop questioning it. But I was wrong." Lisa watched his face. The lines etched deep into his skin, the kind of lines that only form from years of holding things in. "What did you do?" she asked. Raymond shrugged. "I stopped waiting for permission," he said. "I stopped worrying about whether people thought I deserved to be in the room. I walked in and acted like I owned the place." Lisa smiled faintly. "And did it work?" Raymond's eyes twinkled with quiet mischief. "Sometimes," he said. "Other times, they just found new ways to make the room feel smaller." Lisa nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The belt shuddered as her suitcase finally appeared. Gliding toward her, she stepped forward, lifting it smoothly, letting its weight settle against her side. Raymond watched as she adjusted the handle. "I suppose we keep going," he said. Lisa met his gaze. "We do." They stood there for a moment longer, the crowd thinning around them, until Raymond extended his hand one last time. "It was good meeting you," he said, his voice warm. Lisa shook his hand. "Likewise." As Raymond turned toward the exit, Lisa lingered by the carousel, her suitcase resting against her leg. She didn't move right away. Instead, she let the quiet sink in, grounding herself in the stillness that followed the movement. The world outside was the same as it had always been, full of turbulence. Full of Emily's. Full of moments that asked more of her than she should have to give. But it was also full of people like Raymond. People who kept going. And as Lisa stepped into the brisk night air, she felt the weight of the evening shift. Not lighter, not gone, but easier to carry. The automatic doors slid open, spilling Lisa out into the night like a wave returning to shore. The air outside the airport was cold. The kind of sharp cold that settled in the bones and stayed there. Lisa pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. But it wasn't the weather that made her shiver. It was the quiet. The kind of quiet that followed her long after the flight had landed, pressing itself against her ribs like a reminder. She crossed the pavement to the rideshare pickup area, suitcase in tow. The terminal behind her glowed faintly, a distant hum of life continuing just out of reach. Lisa stood still, waiting, but she wasn't sure what she was waiting for. It wasn't just the car that would take her home. It was something else, something that stretched beyond this night, beyond Emily, beyond the weight of belonging that she carried with her like a second skin. She had learned, long ago, that racism wasn't always loud. Sometimes, it whispered. Sometimes, it simply stood there, existing in the same space as you, unmoving, indifferent, daring you to speak its name. But tonight, Lisa had spoken. And even though the world hadn't shifted beneath her feet, she felt the faintest crack beneath the surface. The car pulled up, headlights sweeping over the sidewalk. Lisa lifted her suitcase and slid into the backseat, the door closing with a soft thud that felt strangely final. The driver, a young man with tired eyes and music playing faintly from his phone, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Heading home?" he asked, his voice soft but casual. Lisa nodded. "Yeah, long day." He smiled faintly, as if he understood more than he let on. "I hear that," he said, pulling away from the curb. The city drifted by outside the window, lights smearing across the glass like brushstrokes. Lisa watched them blur, her mind tracing the edges of the evening, searching for something to hold on to. Home, she thought. It wasn't just a destination. It was the place you carried with you, the place you built inside yourself. Piece by piece, after every long day, every small fight, every quiet war, Lisa thought of her daughter, waiting for her with a half-empty plate of pancakes and questions too big for her small frame. "Why do they touch my hair? Why do they stare? Why do they make me feel different? Mom?" The answers weren't simple. They never were. But Lisa would give her what she could. She would give Jasmine the truth. Even if that truth was heavy. Even if it came wrapped in the silence that followed every Emily. The driver's voice broke the quiet. "Almost there," he said, slowing at a red light. Lisa nodded, staring at her reflection in the window. For a moment, she saw her mother's face staring back, stern but soft. The way it always was when she spoke about the world. Her mother used to say, "You'll get tired, baby, but you don't stop. You hear me? You don't stop." Lisa heard her now. The light turned green, and the car rolled forward, the road stretching out beneath them. When they pulled into her neighborhood, the world felt smaller, quieter. The streetlights flickered, casting faint halos onto the pavement. Lisa stepped out, suitcase in hand, and watched the car disappear down the road. Her house stood ahead, lights glowing in the front window. Jasmine's silhouette appeared behind the curtain, small, but full of life. Lisa smiled. The night hadn't erased the weight she carried. But standing there, watching her daughter wait by the window, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't carrying it alone. And maybe that was enough. For now.